Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're going to talk about intelligence. And when I say the word intelligence, my guess is certain images come to your mind. Maybe Einstein comes to your mind, or Stephen Hawking, or some NASA engineers, or that professor you had in high school that was really, really smart. And you're thinking maybe about IQ tests. You're thinking about all sorts of scientific or brilliant, mindful scientists, engineers, and thought leaders in that way. Why didn't you think about Michael Jordan? Why didn't you think about Walt Disney? Why wasn't the image of Michael Jackson as a dancer the first thing you thought of when I said the word intelligence? Why was all that other stuff the first thing that popped into your head? So that's what we're talking about today here on the Personality Hacker Podcast.
Yeah, we're gonna tackle this concept of multiple intelligence. And what's so fascinating about this is I think this is a concept that's gaining a lot of acceptance in, I think it gets some criticism too, but I think it's gaining a lot more acceptance than the traditional concept of IQ as being the final and last arbiter on what intelligence is, and genius in particular. I remember reading someplace that, we have sort of co-opted our take on Myers-Briggs and turned it into what we call the genius assessment or the genius test. And I'll be honest, I'm not 100% happy with it. Every once in a while I'm like, should we call it something else? But when I think about why we ended up calling it the genius test, even though it really is a sort of a different, it's not really a super different take on Myers-Briggs. It's more of sort of an introduction to the deeper elements of Myers-Briggs and in particular cognitive functions. And the reason why we called it the genius test is because we have a fundamental belief that everybody has some genius inside of them. And we believe that it's manifested in different ways. And I think probably the model that is the most compatible with our take on Myers-Briggs is the concept of Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. Now, he started out with 6, and then over time it developed to 7, and then it developed to 8, now it's up to 9, and there could be more. And so now instead of calling it, Gardner's 6 intelligences or 7 intelligences, now they just call it multiple intelligence because more seems to be coming online. And I think that's fascinating. I think it's amazing that it's not just a matter of a set of styles of intelligence. It's this concept that we are continuing to discover different components and elements of what intelligence can mean.
Yeah, we've seen a little bit of an opening to this. In the 1980s, when knowledge workers came online, we had a lot more people working at desks, at computers. Our culture was definitely shifting from an industrial culture to a knowledge work culture. And the idea of emotional intelligence came up during this time period in the workplace because people are having to, it's not about sitting on a factory line and putting a part together. It's now about thinking through that email you have to write or that letter you have to write or that meeting you have to run with other people. And that requires a lot of what has been defined as emotional intelligence, being able to work with other people, being able to help manage their emotions, your emotions in getting something done. And so we've seen an emergence of some other types of intelligences coming out in the last 30, 40 years based around the need that's here in the workplace. And I think that taking Gardner's ideas and some of these other intelligences, I think the world's ready for some more of these to begin popping up because we have such a disparate workforce. We have such broad needs as humans now in a 24/7, always plugged in culture that all of these types of intelligence can shine. So I think that we've already seen a little bit of this trending with the idea of emotional intelligence coming into the workplace. And I think it's going to be more and more of these others as well.
I think also on a geopolitical scope, we're going to need to tap into these different styles of intelligence because we're facing the need to bridge very different levels of development on the planet. Because we're a global citizenship at this point, we're not just citizens of whatever country we're living in. We're really citizens of the world, and we do so much cross-pollinating and so much cross-communication that we're going to need to call upon all these different styles of intelligence to get us to be sort of one global society. to be able to communicate with each other if we can't just use standard words, or to be able to find ways in which we're similar to each other that isn't just, well, we're sharing all of our, say, individual values. We're going to have to communicate with each other even if we maybe have slightly different values or things that are important to us. We're going to still need a way to communicate. And the more we can understand our differences and the ways that we individually shine, the more we're going to be able to hold space for each other on a massive scale. So that's the massive macro zoom out. And I think on a zoom in, the more we can understand where we as individuals shine, the more models we can take in that understands the concept of intelligence and what we bring to the table, the more we accept ourselves as we are and stop comparing and contrasting ourselves with everyone around us because we're not as quote unquote stereotypically smart as the person next to us. What's interesting, you mentioned emotional intelligence, and that was really brought on the scene by Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. And I think that came out just a little bit around, like maybe around the time period, maybe a little after Howard Gardner's concept of 6 intelligences came out. I think Gardner's work came out in like the early 80s, and Goleman's work came out late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact timelines. I'm sure you, the listener, may remember, and you can let me know in the comment section. But this concept of different styles of intelligence, I mean, I would argue that what Goleman was talking about, Daniel Goleman with emotional intelligence, is actually something that Howard Gardner talked about in at least 2 different styles of his intelligences. So there's these different models. Some of them are more zoomed in. They have more distinctions around the styles. Others are more sort of a holistic approach to the concept of intelligence, but they're still creating distinctions. And what's funny is before we even started this podcast, you were mentioning that, you walk down the street and you ask somebody what their IQ is, even if they've never taken an IQ test, they at least know what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
They might say something to the effect of like, well, I don't know because I've never taken a formal IQ test. But they know there's an instrument. They know that IQ measures a form of intelligence. When they run into somebody super smart, they go, oh, I bet that person has a high IQ. Somewhere in the back of their unconscious mind, that probably is coming up for them. However, when it comes to emotional intelligence, if you walk down the street and said, what's your EQ? The person would probably need you to define EQ to begin with. And if you said emotional intelligence, they would go, oh, that's a thing? Yeah. So IQ is definitely integrated in social consciousness, whereas concepts like EQ, that's still coming online. That's not nearly as pervasive. And then just in recent years, I think I heard the term CQ in the last 5 years, which was creative intelligence or your creative quotient. So there's different styles of intelligence that are in a more broad brush way coming online, and yet people are not as aware of them. So I think it's important to gain awareness for these different styles, again, so that we can stop comparing and contrasting ourselves with other people and start recognizing where we as individuals shine. You
said that when you went onto the street, or if you go onto the street and ask somebody, what's your IQ, they would know that that's a form of intelligence measurement. I would argue that most people that you would run into that say, what's your IQ, they would assume that's the only measure of intelligence is your IQ. I think there's almost this sense of IQ and analytical intelligence is the same thing as just intelligence. There is no distinction, in other words. Like, that is intelligence. Anything else is not intelligence. That's something else completely. If you're Michael Jordan and you're really good at basketball, that's not another form of intelligence. That's just you're really good at basketball. You would have a high IQ if you were intelligent.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, how most people have categorized this. It's almost like, a brand name has become the thing we ask for. We don't ask for tissues anymore. We ask for Kleenex because Kleenex has done such a pervasive job of making that sound like that's the thing, right? But it's actually a tissue you're asking for. And it's almost the same thing with the IQ tests have branded themselves so well that that's the only intelligence we seem to resonate with when we talk about intelligence is that analytical test-taking or measured intelligence in an analytical way.
Right. Well, and I do think IQ measures different styles of intelligence, especially,
sure.
We're going to break down Gardner's different multiple intelligences in just a moment. So we'll take into account what some of these are probably, looking for, but it's not a comprehensive list. IQ is not looking for all 9, what's currently 9 of how, Howard Gardner's intelligences. IQs do not measure all 9.
I'm not actually talking about what IQ measures. I'm talking about what the public consciousness thinks it measures.
Right.
Which is the public thinks it only measures analytical intelligence in like a book smart, scientific way or mathematical way.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's the only kind that's important. right? And what's interesting is that we have, because there's an elitism around that, I think we instinctively know as people, we do have different styles of intelligence. I think truth seems to be something that is instinctive inside us. And when our society doesn't account for a full truth, there's a part of us almost on a societal level that gets a sense of cognitive dissonance. And we start to have a knee-jerk response against the incomplete truth that society is carrying, if that makes sense. And so we all know that there's going to be different styles of talent, skill, and intelligence. But since we as a society have somehow decided that we're only going to acknowledge, analytical, maybe some linguistic intelligence, and maybe some spatial intelligence in there, then all the other forms of intelligence get massively underplayed. And so then we get sort of this knee-jerk response. We get an elitism, like almost like a reverse elitism, even though reverse elitism isn't a thing, it's just elitism, but it carries the concept. We get this sort of reverse snobbery or reverse elitism about people who are really smart. And we end up rejecting analytical intelligence, right? Because we think those people think they're better than us, when really it's us fighting for our right to be smart in a different way. I think that's one of the reasons why we want our presidents to be folksy and not to be, sort of these armchair philosophers, and that puts us off. And so we end up voting in somebody who might not be as qualified a leader because we didn't like that they came across as smug. Even if the smug guy might be the best guy for the job, we don't like his attitude. So another part of it is that when we end up ignoring all these different styles of intelligence, all these different ways that genius can show up, then we end up making bad decisions because we have knee-jerk responses to these social concepts. So not only do we downplay our abilities, we end up downplaying somebody else's abilities, even if they shouldn't have their abilities downplayed, just like we shouldn't have our abilities downplayed. It creates this whole ecosystem of sort of this mutual rejection of each other, when really understanding how these things can play out should be creating mutual acceptance of each other and simply going, oh, where should you be fitting the best? Like what place in society are you best suited to serve everybody else? And instead of rejecting that concept because I think I might not have a place in society, going, I have one too, and let me make sure I find that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's when we talk about personality hacker and personality typology, that's one of the things that drives us, is this understanding, even if you don't know the different personalities of the people in your life, just knowing that they have different personalities from you is helpful, because you're like, okay, I'm just going to they're probably just different. They're not trying to be obtuse. They're not trying to be a difficult person. They're just different than me. And the same thing happens with intelligence. I think you see it as, okay, that person's not the book smart, bookworm type intelligent person, and yet they're showing up maybe with sports in a very kinesthetically intelligent way. So let's go through this list. Let's just kind of in random order here, no particular order, go through the listing of Gardner's intelligences at the time of this recording. Now, he might expand this in the future, but right now there's 9 of them, and we'll just kind of go down the list and talk a little bit about each one of them, and then we'll wrap it up with some application on what we think this can be as a takeaway. The first that just in random order is a verbal or linguistic intelligence. So this is a command of language, the written word, being able to speak well, write well, also being able to learn grammar and structure of other languages beyond just your first primary language. It's the ability to understand how linguistics work at a fundamental level. And obviously people like this go into writing and speaking and communicating, storytelling, poets, authors, speakers. This is the type of industry a lot of people that have this intelligence will end up in.
Yeah, well, and they're also good storytellers. A good storyteller is somebody who can spin a narrative. And we get hypnotized by stories. We're hypnotized by narratives. So you can see the real power of somebody having high verbal linguistic intelligence in areas of persuasion, being able to spin a good narrative so that we're like, I'm totally with you. Being able to help people shift perspectives and being able to help people see a bigger, wider context by being able to tell that story so a person can go, yeah, okay, I'm there, I'm with it. I can see a bigger context.
Absolutely. So the next type of intelligence is the mathematical logical intelligence. And this would be the group of people that we've classically in our culture so far here in the West at least have identified as that that, nerdy person that can really take a test well, score high on an IQ test. They're good with problem solving, if-then logic, formal logic, mathematics, figuring things out, scientific data. This person's really good at being able to absorb that kind of information and understand it at a fundamental level.
Yeah, it's also associated with what's called fluid intelligence. And fluid intelligence is the ability to solve problems in situations independent of acquired knowledge. So you don't necessarily have to have the information plugged in first. You can show up to a novel situation and figure your way out in that situation just by using reason and logic without having to have pre-learned a piece of information to get your way through it. So it's also associated with fluid knowledge, which I think is why this might be one of the forms of intelligence that we're most likely to accept as a society. Because we see a person enter a situation, maybe not have any information, and just be able to, beautifully work their way through the problem solving. And it always wows the audience. And I think just like verbal linguistic intelligence is something that has broad application. So we usually can tell when somebody's really quote unquote smart because they're good at, like we said, spinning a narrative, communicating well, being very fluent with their words. This is another kind of intelligence that seems to have a lot of broad application. So we as a society see it, we observe it in a lot of contexts, so we're more likely to accept it as a form of intelligence.
Absolutely. Next type of intelligence, musical intelligence. I remember when I was a kid, I took about a year of piano, and my brother took a year of saxophone, and he picked up a saxophone without any sheet music and could literally hear a song and just begin playing along, picking out notes with this song at a very young age. He was 7 years old. First time he'd picked up an instrument like this. And I was like, wow, that is incredible. And I was always envious of his ability to just get musical notes and be able to pick up musical, rhythm and tempo and all this stuff almost instinctively. And this is a form of intelligence, this ability to be musically inclined and understand how music works and just basically get music.
Yeah, when you, at the beginning of the podcast, you said, why don't you think of Michael Jackson? And you mentioned dance. When I think of Michael Jackson, man, I think of his redonkulous ability to beatbox.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to see...
Instinctive.
Incredible genius, just look up Michael Jackson beatbox and just watch him, not necessarily in a music video, but when he was interviewed and he would just start beatboxing for the interviewer to show him how he layered music in his head and how he layered music for what ended up becoming some of the best and greatest pop songs of all time ever. I mean, my brain explodes, right? It's just incredible to watch. And the reason why I find this kind of intelligence, this is an easy one to downplay, right? Oh, so you're really good at music. Okay, that's cool, but is that really a genius that the world needs? What I love about the concept of acknowledging and accepting musical intelligence as a very valid and important form is that music, you mentioned this before, music is like math.
Yeah.
It is a language that we all speak, even if we're not speaking the same actual verbal language. It is a way to tie people together and feel connection to somebody who you might not be able to send a message from your mind to their mind in any other way. It's a way to communicate abstractions and concepts and emotions and feelings without having to learn somebody else's actual practical language. So I think it's a very powerful form of intelligence if we could accept it and then maybe harness it for that purpose.
It's very experiential. It's basically recreating an experience in somebody else by listening to a piece of music or being engaged in musical creation with you. It's very participatory and very much an emotional, immersive experience. So I think you're right, it is a very powerful one. And much like the analytical mathematics, it is something that I think crosses all generations, it crosses different cultures and timelines, and it's very, very widely used. The other intelligence is visual spatial. So you're talking about people who have this ability to paint, to draw. They can look at something and kind of guess if something's, balanced or if it is, how far distance it is. They're good at photography. They have a lot of interesting ways of knowing the spatial or visual representation of something. And they just get it. They intuitively get the visual spatial representation. And this is a form of intelligence.
Yeah, think about people who are really good at eyeballing things or really great with navigation.
Yeah.
This is something that...
Sense of direction.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's the ability to problem solve when things are concrete. So we talked about, mathematical logistical intelligence as being able to problem solve when you don't have the data in mind. This is being able to problem solve when you've got like physical concrete things in your way, or when you have to put them together and make them, sort of work together in a concrete environment. And obviously things like architecture fall under this, and just being able to basically produce a world that is intuitive with how humans work, as opposed to, I think of I think I've mentioned this before, but my sister-in-law is getting her doctorate in psychological architecture, which is the ability to understand how people naturally move through physical spaces and encourage them to change their behavior. She wants to do it for environmental purposes, which is the question of, and I'm sure it's way more complex than this, but I always think of the concept of, how do we encourage people to recycle by simply setting up an architectural design that gets them to recycle, right? Like they don't even have to think about it, they're just doing it. And this would all be a part of spatial intelligence.
Yeah, and like the Walt Disney Company at their theme parks has determined that it takes about 20 paces before someone will drop a piece of trash on the ground. And so they make sure they've got a garbage can within 20 steps of any one spot in their theme parks to encourage people to either dispose of the litter or to recycle. And this is something they used, this idea of understanding spatial relationships to encourage people to a behavior that they want.
And this is not just visual. Like, people can have spatial intelligence even if they're blind,
sure,
right? They can navigate through a space just by almost like instinct. So it's not just visual. That's why they also say visual spatial. But the visual component, for most people who are not blind, is a big part of it.
My mom grew up working at a camp for the blind as a kid. And there was a kid that would come every summer, and he would use a noise in his mouth to send a sound, like a clicking sound. And he would basically hear the echo of that sound bouncing off of objects in front of him to be able to determine where he could walk throughout the camp. And he would just do this all day. And that was it was a form of spatial intelligence. He couldn't see what was happening, but he could basically sense that from the sound coming back to him.
No kidding. Geez, sonar.
Yeah, basically. That's what he did.
Yeah, wow. Crazy.
So the other another form of intelligence is body kinesthetic intelligence. This is being very in command of your body, being very aware of your physicality. I have a cousin in my family who has very high, off the charts, kinesthetic intelligence. We were bike riding once, and his tire exploded on the front of his bicycle, and it like launched him into the air. And before you knew it, he had like put his hand down, caught himself. We're going like 30 miles an hour, right, down the street. Caught himself and had like spun himself around and was standing upright while the bike was still crashing. He had like hit the pavement. He got a scrape on his face, but he just popped himself right back up and just started walking, picked up the bike, grabbed it, and we took it over to get it fixed. And it was almost like he didn't have to think about it. It just happened. And you've seen these people too. You throw like a baseball at their face, and they just, like out the side of the corner of their face, they'll reach up, they'll just grab the ball out of the air, like instinctually. You don't even know how they can respond that quickly. But these are some of our greatest athletes. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods. They have a kinesthetic ability, a command over their own body that is just unparalleled.
Yeah, it also allows people to use like tools and objects as sort of I remember when I was, we were talking about in the Myers-Briggs system, the people who tend to have the highest kinesthetic intelligence are generally the sensor perceivers, so SPs. And there's something that happens with their brain where when you give them a tool, it's almost like their brain automatically remaps their body awareness to include that tool. And it's like the tool is now an extension of their body. It could be something like a graphite pencil, and they're incredible artists, all the way up to like a car or a plane. So they're amazing pilots or amazing, race car drivers. So that would be included in the body kinesthetic. Now, I just made a connection between like a Myers-Briggs type and an intelligence type. And you probably are, as we're talking about this, you probably are making these connections yourself. And we'll touch on that just a little bit at the end of this. It's not always 100%. There's not necessarily a direct correlation with all these forms of intelligence in a single Myers-Briggs type or a single Myers-Briggs temperament. Yet there are going to be correlations.
There's trends.
There's trends, exactly. Yeah. So there's definitely be looking out for that as we continue on in this list.
So the next form of intelligence is interpersonal intelligence, and it's pretty much what it means. It's understanding the interplay between persons or other people. So this person that has this kind of intelligence can walk into a room, instantly know who is high status, low status in the room. They're great at organizing people. Hey, it just started raining. We've got to go out on the porch and bring in a bunch of cushions so they don't get wet from the rain. Hurry. And they know how to organize people, motivate people, work with people. They understand the dynamics of maybe somebody that's not getting along with each other. They understand all of these types of things, and they can help people work together in harmony, which is that is so needed in our modern world. It's just crazy, right?
Well, absolutely. Like this is where we get our social skills from. And this is our ability to refine our unspoken and spoken social contracts. And so this is also where persuasion comes from. This is where we enjoy discussing and mulling things over, and even maybe debate. We enjoy interacting with other people and refining our interactions. And like you just said, this is an intelligence, a form of intelligence that is absolutely imperative for, preventing, say, war on a macro scale. I was just listening to somebody talking about compassionate listening, and they mentioned that compassionate listening is understanding that people heal simply by listening to them. As in, we go through a lot of our toxicity just by feeling heard. So even if we're spewing resentment or spewing all sorts of icky stuff, the person who's listening recognizes that they're healing the other person, or are a part of their healing, just by being there to receive that information. And then once the person has been understood and feels understood and knows the listener is holding space for that, whatever it is that they're giving, then they can mull through the particulars. But that first piece is listening. That is incredible interpersonal intelligence to be able to figure that out. Now, that might be a no-brainer to you might be listening and going, yeah, isn't that obvious? And yet that's not obvious, because we're not all doing it. If it was so
Certainly.
obvious, everybody would just be doing compassionate listening, which we have a tendency not to do. We have a tendency to go, if we hear something that we don't like because the person we're compassionate listening with is maybe attacking us, we immediately go to the defensive. Compassionate listening means that we just listen. We just allow the other person to feel complete and understood in that way. So it is obvious on a sort of a cerebral level, but it's not obvious on a practical level. But people with high interpersonal intelligence, that kind of thing isn't just a concept, it's actually a reality for them, and that's what really shows that kind of intelligence.
Along the same vein, there's also another form of intelligence, is intrapersonal intelligence. So this is the ability to be self-reflective, to spend time meditating, going inside your heart, your mind, thinking about the things that are important to you, how things impacted you. Maybe you reacted badly to somebody and you're like, why did I do that? And you can sit down and you can go in and reflect on yourself and say, okay, here's what's going on internal for me. Here's what this is meaning for me. And a lot of times this shows up, in a tangible way through journaling, or maybe writing a memoir or diaries, and focusing on your own internal personal growth. And one of the things I always think is the more personal something is to you, probably the more universal it is too. So if you're experiencing something deeply personal and you have the intelligence to go inside and say, oh, here's why when this person said this thing to me, I reacted this way. This is the emotion coming up for me. That's probably similar to a lot of people's experience. So this intelligence, by going inside yourself and seeing how you're responding, can be powerful for you to help other people and to bring that to the world, to have that full self-understanding, that intrapersonal intelligence.
Yeah, another word for this could be called introspection. And being able to introspect is how we're also able to, hold space for ourselves, find self-forgiveness, and also self-refinement. If we are harboring thoughts that don't serve ourselves and other people, the best way to know that is to go inside oneself and see those thoughts and actually be able to, I always think of it as like internally we're just this messed up ball of yarn that's all tangled up. And introspection is the ability to pull those threads apart and observe them and see them and take a relatively neutral stance for a time, and then maybe have some self-criticism there, but not the kind that beats ourselves up, but the kind that allow us to fillet out what's serving us and what isn't serving us. The higher the introspection, the more we're able to that whole concept of showing up as your best self or be the change in the world you want to see, right? That introspection is how we become that change. And then we can, we're an example to other people. So you can see how introspective intelligence or this very important self-exploration form of intelligence would be very important for the modern world.
Naturalist is another form of intelligence. And I actually worked at a zoo for 5 years in their marketing department. And it was interesting to see that a lot of the zookeepers at the zoo I worked at had very high naturalist intelligence. They understood animals in a way that I just will never understand animals. They liked animals in a way I just will never like animals. It's not my gig. I don't have this as one of my strengths. But I would look around and they had compassion and they had understanding of almost like how animals think. And another example of this would be Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer. It's a popular television program, but this man fundamentally understands the psychology of dogs to the degree where he can help dogs. Well, and he also says it's not so much about the dog, it's about the owner.
Exactly.
But it's the interplay between the owner and the dog, and he helps the owners understand the psychology of the dog. And he focuses a lot of his work on the owner to understand that. But these kind of people, they have a knack for this. They understand the workings of the natural world. People that can garden, botanists, people that understand plants, how different plants interact. I mean, chefs, all sorts of these intelligence come up in our world that are so needed, and it's something that I don't seem to major in at all, any of these, but I'm wowed by people that do.
Well, you actually might, not in the same traditional way. What's interesting about the naturalistic intelligence is it actually came online later. This was, much later after Gardner came up with these concepts of multiple intelligence. He proposed this one, I think, in the late 90s. And what's interesting about this is that this is also the seed of ecology, understanding the interplay between the natural world and humanity, right? Like we live in all of these ecosystems, and these ecosystems allow us to have a holistic perspective of what's going on. Like when we break a part of the ecosystem, we're breaking a part of us as humans, or our ability to navigate the world in an intelligent way. And I don't think I have a naturally high naturalistic intelligence, but I think that whenever I hear these concepts about ecosystems, my ears perk up because I know that that's very important. I think you probably feel the exact same way. So maybe you and I don't have a naturally high naturalistic intelligence, but I think you and I both value the concept of understanding things in terms of ecosystems.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I really prize this concept. I mean, again, this is going to be an intelligence that is absolutely imperative as we move forward as humans, so we don't just say destroy the planet we're living on going, oh, well, whatever. Oil spills, okay, deforestation, whatever. All the methane gas and, because we're absolutely farming ridiculous amounts of cattle that, whatever, no big deal. These are the kinds of people that we're going to be relying on more and more to help guide us through what could be, a disastrous time period in human history.
The final intelligence we're going to talk about is existential. So this is the high-minded intelligence of understanding. I hesitate to use words spiritual things, but it is somewhat spiritual in nature. Understanding the higher self, the higher spiritual elements of life. These are and this can come down to a practical level, like somebody working on causes, working on humanitarian efforts, someone who's thinking about things that are a little bit more high-minded in an existential way. So this is an intelligence that can show up in a lot of ways. I would say people that are leading big charities have developed, either have this as a natural talent or have developed this over time to see. It's almost like ties in that ecology thinking too. It's like the human ecology of, hey, these people over here don't have water. We need to make sure this happens. All the way from that to people that are interested in astrology or the afterlife or mediums, things of this nature. There are people that have a sense of this type of intelligence. They understand this world. They understand that there's a non-physical plane in some weird way that I don't fully understand myself. And they live in this and they understand this to the degree where they can bring that to us as an intelligent person. Yeah,
Gardner added this later too, along with naturalistic intelligence. And I don't think using the phrase spiritual intelligence is entirely inaccurate. I think he defaulted to existential though, because it was more about meaning. It was more about, like you mentioned, this concept of a higher plane or a different plane. But I think he said existential because he didn't want to necessarily indicate that people who weren't more on that level of mediums and astrology and that sort of thing, there's a scientific level to this as well that acknowledges an existential piece, even if the scientific person doesn't necessarily buy into something that they can't personally observe. Even if they're not immediately buying into a belief system, they're still having questions of meaning, and they're still having questions of, or that kind of person might still have a question of the bigger picture and what's going on outside of what the concrete world has to offer. And so I think the reason why he used existential is because he wanted to make sure that he wasn't disqualifying either type. Both styles are what is wrapped into this concept of existential intelligence. And as far as I'm concerned, this might be one of the most important intelligences right now to get us motivated to go to the next level as humanity. If we just stick with what we can observe and see, it could be kind of depressing because people don't seem to be getting along very well in a lot of different contexts or areas. I do think, though, people who have naturally high existential intelligence and gravitate towards those pieces are the ones who help lead us forward in a more positive and optimistic frame. They're the ones who go, let's talk about meaning, and let's talk about applied meaning, and let's talk about an optimistic, positive applied meaning. So I think people with high existential intelligence, especially if they're using it for good and to give back to the world, I mean, this is a completely subjective comment, but I think it might be one of the most important intelligences that is represented right now.
Well, certainly, if you're listening and you feel you've got high existential intelligence, you're probably going to be one of the people that help us understand the interplay between artificial intelligence that's coming online. And, basically, computers will be able to have a moral or ethical conscience within the next 50 years, it's predicted. So how's that going to work with humans? And how are we all going to interplay in this new world where computers can think and reason and actually reason out ethics on their own, independent of what they're programmed to think? And how will that work? And I think people that have this intelligence are going to be needed during that time period to help us in all of this say, okay, how does this work? That's just an example of something coming down the pike, right?
Yeah.
Coming down the road, that's going to be needed. And so if you have this intelligence, obviously it's needed right now. There's so much challenge in the world that we need that right now too. But these are some technological things that are going to bring this into the forefront as well.
And fostering these different styles and acknowledging and holding space for them and going, let's see all of these as being just as important as the other ones, and let's do what we can to acknowledge these different styles and foster it in the children that are, the next generations that are coming up, and reward it when we see it, not creating contexts that are one size fits all, maybe in the school system, and being able to, go, I think that kid has high existential intelligence. Let's go ahead and acknowledge and honor that, and maybe do what we can to throw them into situations where that continues to grow.
Yeah, you mentioned the school system, and you shouldn't have done that. 'Cause anytime I have a chance to talk about the education system in the West, I'm just like
triggered.
I'm going to speak up. I was at and I probably tell the story at one point on a podcast or one of our programs. I can't remember when, but I was at my son Gunner's school 2 years ago, and I was baffled at. I didn't actually go to school, right? I was primarily homeschooled my entire life, and I lived a very free-form education, very free choice learning. I got to kind of decide what I want to learn. So I didn't have the experience of going to school. So going into a grade school environment, a public school grade school environment in an inner city, in a very large city here in the East Coast of the United States, is a very eye-opening experience for me. I think it's one of the highest funded school systems in the country, and I was watching like 35 to 40 kids in this classroom with this teacher, and she's got an aide, she's got an assistant, and she's trying to get all these students through the material together. And I'm watching all these different students, and I'm here at Personality Hacker. I understand personalities, I understand different intelligences, and I'm watching all these kids, and I'm going, this looks like a disaster to me. Why would anybody even attempt to take a disparate group of 35, 7-year-olds and try to educate them in the exact same way every single day, moving them all through a linear sequence of material? And most of her time was just spent managing the energies and the hyperactivity and the movement of all these kids. She actually didn't get too much teaching because there were kids that were jumping up. They couldn't sit still. There was a boy who was so hyperactive. He had like this other aide, I guess, or teacher that traveled with him from classroom to classroom to help him stay calm and help him stay focused because he was so on edge and hyperactive. And I'm sitting here thinking, man, what if schools would tailor our education to the needs and the intelligences, the personality types and the intelligences of each of these individual students? And we say, well, that can't happen. There's one teacher for 35 kids. Well, but what if we had technology that could do that? I mean, what if like every kid got an iPad when they came to class and they would go through their material at their own pace, and the iPad would deliver and their app would deliver new content based on how fast or how slow they're learning. So they're all together and the teacher's managing it, but it's more self-directed and it's maybe game-based, and it's based on their intelligence. It's based on, and the computer's learning about them as it goes.
And when you say based on their intelligence, you don't mean based on their traditional IQ level. You mean based on their natural form of intelligence that they favor, considering these different intelligences.
Absolutely. Can you imagine, like, you go to class as a 7-year-old, and as you're going through this game on this little device that you're learning, maybe you're learning some math skills, the computer, the app is starting to understand, oh, this kid probably has a musical intelligence. So it starts to musicify all of your math lessons. It starts to put it in musical terms, or it uses music in part of that because it understands that that's going to be how you learn best. Like you already have a natural aptitude for music. And then it also suggests, hey, maybe you want to take music class. Like maybe the teacher's working with you. Hey, you want to maybe go down a music track more and you want to do this. But this one size fits all, standardized testing, standardized curriculum, a bell rings and a bunch of students stand up like a herd of cattle and they walk out of one room and go into another room and they walk in and sit down. It's like, I'm looking at this thinking, I feel like I went into a time warp of insanity. And these poor teachers, I look at the teachers and these are good people. These teachers are intelligent, they're good people, but they're in a fundamentally broken system that they can't contextualize this fast enough for the kids that are in their classrooms. And I think it's like we're just leaving our children in the dust because we're not recognizing these different I think it's cultural, though. I mean, during the Cold War, during the Industrial Revolution, we need a lot of math and science, engineers. You know, we need a lot of those types of scientific thinkers.
Or
right?
at least it was believed you needed a bunch of those in order to win the Cold War.
To make bombs, to beat, Russia at chess games or whatever it was. And it's kind of like that's really no longer the world, but we're still stuck in this old way of doing things. So I think it's cultural why the IQ has become almost synonymous with intelligence in general.
Yeah.
And often, people that do well in school end up being teachers themselves or professors themselves. So it's a very self-congratulatory system in some ways.
Yeah,
especially in higher ed.
It self-perpetuates for sure.
But it's like, can you imagine a world with me as you're listening where we're taking into account the individuality of people as they're learning? Because I look at all three of my kids, our kids, and they all are excited about learning stuff. Now, my 2 older boys are in school and I can start seeing that getting beat out of them, the excitement of learning. But my little 3-year-old, she's really excited about learning. She loves to learn and she willingly asks questions. She's curious about life. And can you imagine if we tailored her education to her actual, one of these 9 intelligences that pops up for her?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you can see that there's...
You can hear the passion in my voice.
I know. And we might even need to do an entire podcast on the education system just so we can do compassionate listening for Joel and let him get some of this stuff out of your system, because I know it's a passionate subject for you, and I think that you have a lot of material to say on it. Not that we want to go down too far down this rabbit hole, but I can see what you're saying, especially when different concepts like Common Core are introduced to elementary school. I think they use it even on high school, don't they? I think Common Core is all the way through.
Multiple states have, almost across the board, a lot of states have adopted it, yeah.
Yeah, well, they get perks for adopting it. And people just talk about how Common Core is the worst thing ever. And I was sitting down with a teacher and I was like, okay, explain Common Core to me. What is Common Core? And when they were describing it, I was like, this is totally intuitive. This is an intuitive way of learning. However, it's being forced on, the elementary school system. I've worked in the elementary school system. I worked in multiple different elementary schools, and I have observed many elementary schools, and it is primarily filled with censor judgers. That is the number one most common type to be in an elementary school. And they're being forced to teach children through a highly intuitive methodology. Now, that would be like me as a highly intuitive person being able to teach however I wanted to, or like the way that made sense to me for a long time. And then all of a sudden now I'm being forced to teach in a way that makes no sense to me, like on a personality type level. Like I'm being forced to only teach through, say, rote memorization. I'd want to blow my brains out. It's not being tailored at all to me as a teacher. And because it's not tailored to me as a teacher, I have no idea how to teach it to kids. So it felt like, it kind of felt like this concept of communism being implemented in a Graves 4 society. People rail against communism because communism was never meant to be Graves 4. Now, if you don't know what Graves 4 means, go back to our podcast on the Graves levels or the Graves model, and we talk about all these different levels and what they mean. And Graves 4 is a very massively institutionalized, scarcity-minded level, right? Like there's not enough to go around, and so we have to lock everything down. Well, when communism, which requires abundance thinking in order to actually work, when communism is implemented in a Graves 4 culture or society, of course it's going to be disaster because its fundamental principles require a radically different style of thinking in order to at all be successful. So now we have this terrible taste in our mouth about what communism is. Communism is because we've only ever implemented it in scarcity mindset. Now, I'm not pro or anti-communism. I think I've never seen it actually implemented the way it was originally intended to, so I'm pretty neutral on the topic. But that's how it felt to me when I saw Common Core. I was like, well, of course it's going to be a disaster. It's an intuitive learning style implemented by primarily a sensory group. Of course it's going to be a disaster. That's not how it was intended at all. And that's just sort of the result. So, I mean, you see these different models sort of clashing and running into each other. And of course, one of the fundamental problems is that it's a one-size-fits-all system. So regardless of it being a sensory style and an intuitive teacher or an intuitive style with a sensory teacher, it's not taking into account the fact that children learn radically different ways and have very different styles of intelligence, and they're going to gravitate towards their personal talents. And so they're going to want to learn in a way that makes the most natural sense to them, and that's going to be what their natural talent is, and that's going to be their natural intelligence.
Yeah. And so think about, just look around the people you interact with daily, your coworkers, maybe the people in your social group, your family, friends, and start to notice some of these intelligences, maybe the trending that they have. You know, is somebody more musically inclined? Is somebody more kinesthetic? Is somebody more book smart? You know, more linguistic focused? Is somebody more mathematical, logical focused? Start being aware of this, and I think this will really help you see where people are showing up. And in my life, when I learned this, I started giving people a little more pass when I'd be talking to them about an issue, right? And I'd be trying to talk in abstract terms and about whatever it is, and it wasn't working real well. I'm like, oh, that person's probably just not intelligent in this way, and I'm probably not intelligent in the way they are. They're talking about, maybe something else I'm not interested in or good at, and I'm like, I don't get this, man. But they just it's a natural knack for them. This is the kind of thing that we can start being aware of as people, and I think this helps bridge the gap in understanding others in a lot of these ways.
Yeah, and I really hope that people take it one step further than just acknowledging. I hope we get to a point where we celebrate the different styles, not just in rewarding people like Michael Jordan, who is the greatest basketball player of all time. Obviously, that guy's celebrated. However, can we celebrate the concept of kinesthetic body intelligence, just in general? And I try to do that with people who I see have high kinesthetic awareness and high kinesthetic intelligence. I try to go, you have super high body intelligence, don't you? And I use specifically the word intelligence. I want to celebrate it because I don't want them thinking, because I would say probably body intelligence, unless you get to a point where we're now throwing crap tons of money at you because you're like a performer on stage, or because you've gone to the Olympics, or because you're Michael Jordan or Tiger Woods or whatever. Like, obviously we celebrate it on that level, but we really undervalue it when it comes to our day-to-day experience. So I like to use the word intelligence specifically to celebrate it in a day-to-day way, because those people are so undervalued that they're the ones who are the most likely to have a knee-jerk response to the other kinds of intelligence that's more acknowledged in society, like the person who has the mathematical logical intelligence or the verbal linguistic. And so they're more likely to get an attitude about it because we don't acknowledge them. We don't celebrate them and what they come to the table with. So I just really hope we get to a point where we celebrate it so that nobody has a knee-jerk response against each other. Nobody is dealing with this whole you're just a pseudo-intellectual, or you're just an intellectual. And it's like, well, can't we acknowledge that, yeah, that person is an intellectual in the traditional classical sense, and you're also an intellectual in a less traditional classical sense? And can we hold space for both?
Absolutely.
One more thing that I want to mention is this concept of, IQ, EQ, CQ. Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence, which if you have not read it, I highly recommend it. Like EQ includes a couple different styles of Gardner's intelligences. It includes like introspective and introspective, and probably a couple different, hodgepodgey bits get thrown in. And so an umbrella for some of those intelligences could be called emotional intelligence. Same thing with IQ, right? It's going to be, it's going to be some verbal linguistic. It's going to be some spatial. It's going to be a lot of logical, mathematical. So these umbrella concepts like IQ, EQ, and CQ, they're going to take into account multiple components of Gardner's intelligences. And I think that's why I like Gardner a little better than the other umbrella styles, because I think it gets more granular. I think I have higher interpersonal intelligence than I have intrapersonal intelligence. And so EQ, I read it through it and I think, kind of. I got it kind of that. But what's nice about it too, although I like Gardner's concept a little better for getting more, diagnostic, I think when it comes to prescription, I do like the more umbrella concept, because just because I have a natural talent for interpersonal intelligence as opposed to intrapersonal intelligence, just because I have a higher preference for one over the other doesn't mean I can ignore the other one. So what's nice about the concept of emotional intelligence is that it includes the ones that I'm not naturally gifted with, and I see an area of weakness there. I see an area where, maybe not spend all my time on that, but at least the Pareto's principle, like what's the 20% that will give me, 20% of effort that will give me 80% return. It's still good to know where we're maybe missing some of that and not completely neglect it. Like, I'm not super high body intelligence. I don't have super high kinesthetic intelligence. And that doesn't mean that I should never go to the gym. It doesn't mean I should never do anything athletic. I need to be healthy physically. So I'm not going to just go, oh, well, I don't have any kinesthetic intelligence, so I'm just going to leave that to other people. I need to build that up a little bit, even though that's not my personality type's natural proclivity. So being able to see some weaknesses there and go, that doesn't give me an excuse to completely ignore it. It actually shines a light on something that maybe I want to do a little work around to make sure that I'm up to a balance level, but maybe not spend all my time filtering, how I'm learning through those styles.
Absolutely. And I think that you can, if you're listening and you're taking this way going, okay, I think I might be that intelligence I see there. Okay. You might want to structure your life a little bit differently, thinking about these in terms of how you go about learning information, how you go about tackling a new project. This can inform a lot. And this can also inform, can you imagine just in a pair bond relationship with your spouse or your lover, just understanding the primary way that you guys show up intelligent-wise. And you probably have a sense of this already with the person you're in a relationship with. But just think about how you'll hold space. Oh, I see. No wonder I've been turning all of the bills over to this person, and they're not really good with numbers. They don't like numbers. It just doesn't come naturally to them, but it comes naturally to me. So why am I not paying the bills and doing the taxes? That would just make more sense, right? And so restructuring your life in ways that make sense to what you come up with in your talents, and maybe they're more inclined in a kinesthetic way or a spatial way. So they're going to be the handyman or the handywoman around the house. And maybe it would be an opposite of a gender role you wouldn't expect. Just because it's the female doesn't mean she can't do the handyman or handywoman stuff around the house. These kind of things, allowing that space to open up and being able to talk through that with your spouse, your lover, your kids, the people in your life. I think this is it's a great tool for understanding where we're all showing up.
Yeah. I mentioned a little bit, I seeded it, that we're going to talk a little bit about how different personality types in the Myers-Briggs system.
I know that you're listening and you want her to say this.
I know.
So here we go.
Where they might land, where each type might land. And I don't think we should do a full, this equals this, because I don't think that necessarily plays out. But there is going to be some, like you mentioned, trends. And I think it's worth acknowledging that in order to help people maybe go, okay, what's my style of intelligence? And then if you are in a pair bond relationship, or you're trying to look for your children's, different style of intelligence, kind of getting a sense for what their type is might lead you to, maybe some of these styles of intelligence. As we mentioned before, sensor perceivers in the Myers-Briggs system are probably going to be the ones who have the highest kinesthetic intelligence. Not always. There's going to be other types that have high kinesthetic intelligence as well, but what we talk about, the cognitive function of sensation, which is the learning style or the perceiving style that sensor perceivers, SPs, in the system use, they're probably going to have the highest version of that. I've seen a trend for feeler perceivers, or what we call authenticity users, are probably going to have the highest intrapersonal intelligence. And extroverted people who use extroverted feeling or harmony, these would be the feeler judgers, are probably going to have the highest interpersonal intelligence.
Yeah, and then you've got people who they excel on actual IQ tests. They've got a great linguistic or mathematical mind, and oftentimes these people are thinker perceivers in the Myers-Briggs system. So they're leading with the process that we've nicknamed accuracy, and they're really good with managing large amounts of data and understanding how that data interplays with each other, which is something that plays well to a classical IQ test.
And so I think, some of these are gonna, they're gonna be open to multiple different personality types. But I think existential is oftentimes intuitive judgers, NJs in the Myers-Briggs system, or the people who use the cognitive function that we call perspectives, are probably going to have some of the highest existential intelligence. But I would say also, extroverts who are intuitives, who are perceivers, ENPs, are the ones that use exploration. They're probably going to also be thinking about this a lot. People who use authenticity, again, are probably going to be doing this. And naturalistic intelligence seems to also be a feeler trait more. So feeler perceivers and feeler judgers tend to have the highest naturalistic intelligence. And I would say that probably with interpersonal, managing large groups of people in order to get something handled, understanding social rules in order to get a goal accomplished is going to be something that thinker judgers, or people who use what we call effectiveness, are probably going to have high as an intelligence. So, and I would think that people who have, pretty good visual spatial or, pretty good verbal linguistic are going to be sensor judgers, or people who use memory. And so there's going to be definitely, like you mentioned, trends. And I please don't use this as like a exhaustive list. If you are a certain type and you find yourself having high intelligence in one of these that isn't necessarily, the assumed style for your Myers-Briggs type, don't discount that, all right? You might be a person that has a very unpredictable form of intelligence for your type, and that's perfectly acceptable too. We just wanted to give you basically a launching pad to go from, and then now in your own life, figure out, your Myers-Briggs type and what intelligence style that you have a tendency to favor. It might be the traditional one, it might be a non-traditional one, that's perfectly acceptable, but those are kind of trends that we've observed that show up.
So what do you think? This is a discussion starter. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is an entire framework of understanding intelligence. So there's a whole book and books and multiple writings that you can go and research on your own to get more detail and nuance.
Yeah, actually, before we completely wrap up, I would highly recommend these resources. Howard Gardner's book, Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligences. Please go check it out and look it up. It'll be in the podcast notes, but please feel free to go read it. It's a fantastic resource. I do recommend Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. That's a winner. Go pick it up. It's a fantastic book. Even if you don't completely buy the concept, there are some true nuggets of gold wrapped in that concept.
Yeah, come over to our website, personalityhacker.com. You can leave a comment or question under this show right in the comment section. You can also join our growing community of like minds just like yourself over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. We're also on a plethora of social media platforms, and they're growing all the time, depending on what platform you prefer to use. So my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.